Okay. Hello. Hello, hello. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the launch of our report, How to Steal a Mountain, How SFU Got Its Land. And I want to begin by offering the official SFU land acknowledgement. And I do that not only to acknowledge the land, but that's something we want to come back to, that land acknowledgement, a little later on in our presentation. So Simon Fraser University respectfully acknowledges the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam nations, on which SFU Burnaby is located. So we're very pleased that there's so much interest in this topic. Other than folks in this room, we have about 200 people on Zoom. We're excited that people want to learn more about this campus, and in particular, the land on which it is, quote, located on. So my name is Nick Blomley. I'm Chair and Professor of Geography here at SFU. This is Kyle Wilmot, an Assistant Professor of Sociology. We are faculty members at SFU. Kyle is Indigenous from the Mohawk Nation, and I am a settler of European ancestry. So this event is co-sponsored by the Departments of Geography, Sociology, Anthropology, and Indigenous Studies. And before I begin, I want to thank those who have made this event possible, particularly Justin Song, John Ng, Tina Klassen, Anka Baker, Hugo Cardoso, and Tess Haywood. So the event is being recorded on Zoom, and for those of you on Zoom, we've turned off your mics and cameras. Unfortunately, our tech capacities were such that it will be difficult for us to invite you to participate by way of questions in the Q&A section later on. If you have any questions, of course, whether in the room or on Zoom, you're very welcome to reach out to Kyle or myself. I'm sure you can find us online. This report, and we have some copies here, is our attempt to start thinking about the role of this university in land dispossession. We pursued this research to understand the colonial history of the space in which we work and the space upon which we stand right now. Our hope is that the findings will be of interest and value to, in particular, the host nations, but also to staff, students, and faculty at SFU, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. The project takes its inspiration from similar initiatives regarding the colonial dimensions of university land across Canada and the United States. And it's our hope that through this presentation and our report, we can begin to make some sense of the colonial processes of injustice that have led to the land acknowledgement with which we begun, and specifically for us to think more about the university's role and responsibilities. SFU's Office for Aboriginal Peoples reminds us, quote, that in acknowledging all the landholders of shared territories, we take on the responsibility of reconciliation by understanding the truth and stories of these lands and the people's relationships and responsibilities to these lands. Our hope is that this report provides some, not all, some of the requisite truth and stories of this land. We were guided in this work by the SFU Office for Aboriginal Peoples, particularly Ron Johnston, who is now retired. Well done, Ron. Gary George is with us today from the office, and thank you, Gary, for joining us. We also took direction early on from other Indigenous friends and colleagues from the outset, including Rudy Reimer, Cliff Atleo, Chris Lewis, and Winona Hall, and our sincere thanks to them. We also shared the report last year with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and while they have reviewed this draft, they and other local host nations were not directly involved in its production. So before we begin the preamble and the findings of this report, I want to invite Winona Hall to offer some opening comments. Dr. Winona Hall is Associate Professor and Chair of Indigenous Studies at SFU. Dr. Hall is Stolo and engages in research on Indigenous governance, justice, as well as decolonization and Indigenous resurgence. I'm going to have to move my multiple microphones over to Winona, which will be a little clumsy. Okay. Yeah, and you can use that as well.
There, is that good? Okay. Thank you for welcoming me. I'm going to start by introducing myself in Halkamilam. Eiswael Siaya Siam Zilialaqua Zilialaqua. Sequelamat Shwalmuxqui Casta Quiquelstom Telsqui Talitza Quas Quaquel Casta Silwayak. In the upriver dialect of Halkamilam, I am saying good afternoon to all my dear loved ones, to all of our respected leaders, and to all of our ancestors. I'm sharing with you my ancestral name, Sequelamat, which comes from my great-great-great-grandmother, and my gifted name from the Stalo people, Quiquelstom. I'm also letting you know that I'm a member of the Squalqual First Nation, now known in English as Squalkale, and a member of the Owayak tribe, now known in English as Chilliwack. I am also Winona Hall, and the current chair of the Indigenous Studies Department here at SFU, and I'm really honored to be here with you today for today's event. And I want to thank you for taking time out of your very busy lives to participate in what I'm sure will be an active engagement in decolonization, as it is a step in coming to understand the truth. And to be honest, I'm not too sure how it came to be that it is me giving these opening comments for Nicholas and Kyle's research into how to steal a mountain. As a criminologist, this isn't normally something I would lend my voice to. And there certainly are better suited and more qualified to speak on this issue. In fact, when they first approached me, I think almost a year ago now, I very gently but politely nudged them in another direction, which they did pursue. Yet here I am. It could be, well, I actually know that those better suited and qualified are already overtasked and overworked. Or it could be that they really do not want to be involved in what can be or should be seen as a controversial research, as it will undoubtedly unsettle the settler. I do know that as Indigenous peoples, our everyday lived experiences are already filled with controversy and our own subtle and even outright acts at displacing colonialism. So understandably, we may not want to sign up for more of it. Or it could be that they know that this is settler work to do. What you will hear today is based on the colonial perspective of European, Euro-Canadian colonial ideology on how land becomes property and how this colonial ideology tried to unilaterally shift our own Indigenous perspectives from land as relative to a colonial one of land as a resource to be owned and managed. Well, it has been over a decade since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission published its report along with its 94 calls to action, over 50 decades since the release of the Indian Control of Indian Education Policy, and over 6 decades since the United Nations adopted the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. It is still very much the case that settler colonialism is alive and well, and in some cases even thriving. I hope for most of you that this is discouraging news, and sadly, not new news. What is hopeful, I hope, is that we are committed to decolonizing, although we may not always know what exactly that looks like, and we are committed to truth-telling, which is such a vital step towards reconciliation. Before we can reconcile, we need to be honest and tell the truth about what it is exactly we are trying to reconcile. And along our collective path in decolonization, exposing the harsh realities of how exactly settler colonialism came to be and continues to be is important work. While we have made some progress in the harsh realities of racism, Indian residential schools, the reserve systems, the pass system, for some reason there is a failure or maybe just resistance to acknowledging how the theft of Indigenous lands has and does contribute to a whole host of colonial systemic issues, such as the current national crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples, the over-representation of Indigenous children in the care of the colonial governments, to name just a few. Truth-telling is a vital, necessary step if we are to be sincere in reconciling Canada's colonial relationship with Indigenous peoples. So far, I am proud of the courage Indigenous peoples have shown in speaking our truth, no matter how difficult this has been. I think it is time that settlers also show their courage in speaking their truth, even if and especially when this means exposing the ubiquitous lies that have been told for so long that they're often mistaken or assumed to be facts. I'm going to end with something several of my students reminded me of this past weekend as I was grading their first assignments. The course is on Indigenous peoples and public policies, and several of my students quoted from the 2012 Tuck and Yang article and reminded me that decolonization should not be used as a vague metaphor in attempts to achieve social justice. They reminded me that decolonization is a concrete process, not something that happens out there, but something that happens when we are ready to hear the truth. So I thank Doctors Bloomley and Wilmot for your careful and fastidious research in what is and should be an uncomfortable exposure in settler theft of land. And again, I thank you for taking the time, for all of you, for being here, whether that is just to listen or to also participate and engage in open and honest dialogue. Yes, you kwasai.
Thank you so much, Winona, for that opening commentary. I want to start by just introducing myself very briefly. I'm Kyle Wilmot, as Nick mentioned, from the Mohawk Nation, a member of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte First Nation, and that helps me think about this research in many ways. But we want to turn now to discuss and think about why we became interested in pursuing this project. And, you know, and as I'm sure that many of you are, frequently astounded by the beauty of this land, of this mountain, and the life that it supports, including ours. And, you know, as I wander around campus at various points in time, I find different points of view that others have gazed on moments before, or perhaps many, many, many years before. And I think that the work that we present here will help us to sort of understand this land a little bit better, at least from understanding its colonial history. And specifically holding to account, right, who was able to enjoy this land and for what reasons. But before we dive into the archival history, we want to make a couple of notes at the outset. So first, we've attended to a small part of the colonial history of this land, specifically through its archival history, but there are many other dimensions to this story, notably the much deeper and denser histories that of the nations whose territory we are on. And the report does not do justice to Indigenous title and jurisdiction on these lands, or the rich narratives and accounts that describe Indigenous relationships to land and the mountains specifically. And I would encourage folks to seek out SFU education prof. Amy Perron and her work entitled Critical Understandings of Land and Water, Unsettling Place at Simon Fraser University, that does this in a much more fulsome way. And those resources can be found at her website, amyparent.ca. And we'd hope to have a collective conversation about this and hope that will continue in the future. We also only focus on Burnaby Mountain campus, right, rather than the Vancouver and Surrey campus, each of which have their own stories. Another point, we are obviously, as Nick mentioned, thinking amongst a group of other scholars who have documented what in the United States are calling land grab universities and different processes that led to that. And we know from scholarship, we know from experience that universities themselves have long benefited from colonial entanglements, whatever they might be. And our report sort of shows in different ways that SFU is no different, and how the university has benefited from a range of political and legal processes that stole wrested land from the nations who had long stewarded this territory, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Coquitlam, and Musqueam. Another final caveat is that this
part of this research is really at the beginning, right? We don't offer this presentation in the spirit of totally completed research. We offer the presentation so that we can share with you, the SFU community, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, so that we can all better understand the colonial history of this university and how settler colonial law around title, property, and taxation solidify settler colonial power in these lands. Well, again, we present this small part of the research and the stories of this land. We invite folks to think here about this with us in this space and beyond, especially in thinking of where to take this research, whether that's classroom or beyond. And our goal is to share this report widely. We have some hard copies available. Most of them are spoken for, but afterward we have some. And the report is, of course, available digitally. And there's QR codes that are circulating. I don't know exactly where they are, but they're out there. And for folks on Zoom as well, you will receive a link at the end of the presentation to the report. So I'll pass it off now to Nick.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks. Is the sound okay in the back? Okay, wanted to make sure. Great to see everyone here. So we're going to get to the story in a minute. We're going to get there. But and the way we're going to do this is I'm going to start by first discussing the first half of the story, and then I'm going to segue over to let Kyle finish up. And then I hope we have time for a Q&A. We have this space for, I think, until 2 or 2:30, so there should be lots of opportunity for discussion. Also want to make very clear that if people want to talk to me individually after the event or separately, then I would imagine Kyle also, then please do reach out to us. So here's SFU on top of Burnaby Mountain. And for those of you on Zoom who've never been to SFU, the university is on top of a mountain. Just to make that clear, it's 1,000 feet, 365 meters, perched on top of this beautiful piece of physical geography. Let me come back before we get going to the official SFU land acknowledgement. Simon Fraser University respectfully acknowledges the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam nations, on which SFU Burnaby is located. I've been giving something like that, an acknowledgement in my classrooms for many years, and it's become more and more problematic for me to give that acknowledgement and then not unpack it. Students will ask, what does it mean that the university is located on a mountain? What does it mean that the land is unceded? These are all questions that I hope we can begin to unpack. So that's the official acknowledgement. But we want to begin with another acknowledgement. We also want to acknowledge that we are on District Lot 210, New Westminster Land District Plan, BCP 45523. And understanding how those two legal realities can both exist in one space is, of course, our problematic. And in particular, we're interested in making sense of how it is that SFU is located on, sorry. Thank you. Got it. Okay, perfect. That's good. Thank you. How it is that SFU is located on unceded traditional territories. And to do so, we've engaged in the past 4 or 5 years, it's been a very long journey, in archival research. And what we're trying to do is to move from this document to this document. The document that you see on the left is SFU's official land title, or at least it was as of 2020. Simon Fraser University is the registered owner of these lots and owns it in fee simple, which is the highest form of land title known to under settler law. The document on the right, and we'll come back to this, is the Crown grant issued in 1875 to District Lot 210, where we are standing right now, issued to somebody called John Rowland Head, and he will be at the end of our story. We actually want to go beyond 1875, as we'll see later on, to an earlier document, but that for now gives us a sort of bracket to our story. How do we move from this to this? What is the so-called chain of title, to use the technical phrase? And we'll try and trace that chain of title as best we can in the time we have available to us. So let's begin from the present and trace backwards. So here we are, of course, or at least this is one rendering of here we are. This is SFU. We are in DL 210 right now. The university, our focus is on these three lots, DL or district lot 209, 210, and 211. A district lot, for those of you who don't know, is about 160 acres. The land to the right here, district lot 211, is now part of what's called University with a C on it. We'll come to that in a second. SFU, according to its title, owns all or parts of district lots 31, 102, 101, 147, 144, 141, 209, 210, 2 and 211. At its inception in 1965, SFU owned a lot more land. Everything above the 300-meter level, we're at 365 meters, and as well as most of the so-called south slope, down running down to about 150 meters. And in 1995, SFU transferred the land outside the ring road here to the city of Burnaby. And as we'll see, it returned that land to the city of Burnaby. This allowed SFU to develop the land over here, the land that became University in District Lot 211. Effectively allowing it to monetize that land and derive a financial benefit from it with the creation in large part of housing, private housing that is now held on 99-year leases. But SFU in 65 had a lot more land. How did it get that land? It got that land through various means. Some of the land was simply purchased, some was expropriated, some was donated. Land came from the province, a bit of land came from the Department of National Defense. You knew that, as well as some small private owners. And this is a plaque actually on campus that records 80 acres that were donated by 3 private individuals. Most of the land, however, came from the district of Burnaby, as it was then. Now the city of Burnaby, which is the municipality, for those of you who don't know SFU, upon which SFU sits. This is a report from May 1963, in which the district of Burnaby notes it has received a request for 1,000 acres of land to create the Simon Fraser University as it will be, and it was agreed that that was a good idea. In October 1963, now we're getting into the archive, Burnaby Council authorized the conveyance of those 1,000 acres, including district lots 209, 210, and 211, where we're sitting now. This was land, of course, then owned by the district of Burnaby. This is in the archive, the Land Titles Archive, and it records an application in 1964 for transfer of title from the Corporation of the District of Burnaby to Simon Fraser University, the price being $1, symbolic transfer, recording a number of lots. You can see them here, including our friends 209, 210, and 211. So this is part of the paper trail, as it were, that then allows us to begin to trace that process of how the land was moved. Now we'll talk about how it was that the city of Burnaby owned the land in 1963 in a minute. But let's just pause on that and talk a little bit about the archive, because the archive is very much part of our story, in particular the opacity of the archive, how difficult it actually is to do this sort of work. Because when you take that document we just saw back on the previous screen and get into the document, it becomes clear that this wasn't simply a transfer of 1,000 acres that were then gifted to Burnaby, because the document actually reveals multiple bundles of bits of land. So this is lot 211, and you can see these are lots. These are the so-called town lots, 33-foot lots that are part of another block, which is part of another block, which is part of lot 211. Each of those bundles of land has its own legal backstory attached to it. If we want to trace the chain of title, in other words, we have to find out who owned that bundle of land prior to the city of Burnaby, and on and on and on and on. The document is many pages long. Now, we'll explain where this complexity came from in a minute. But for now, note each of them is assigned a particular and unique code. That is called, I discovered, a from title number. And in theory, you can take the from title number from that bundle and go back into the archive, line up that from title number and find out who the previous owner was. And that previous owner will have another from title number attached to them, and on through the colonial onion, as it were. That's the theory. The reality is that it's much more complicated than I had supposed. Chain of title research or title research is surprisingly difficult to do. Usually you pay somebody to do it. First of all, it's really hard to access the data. The data, although they're notionally public records, are held by the Land Title and Survey Authority. The Land Title and Survey Authority is a statutory corporation. To access that data, usually you have to pay. There's a paywall attached to those data. If you want to get to the historic data, you have to get into the archive, and that archive, I kid you not, is held in something called the vault. It is literally called the vault. And you have to negotiate your way in, or pay to get in order to access the vault. But once you break open the vault, it turns out the gold is not obvious, because the records themselves are incomplete or simply illegible. They're being badly microfiched by an 18-year-old in 1957, and so consequently, half of them, you simply cannot make sense of them. Trust me, I tried. It took years to figure out how to begin to go through that process, and even then, our story is far from complete. We can chase the chain of title down through some lots, but we didn't go through all those multiple from title numbers. Now, legally speaking, this doesn't matter. Legally speaking, it doesn't matter. Under the so-called Torrens land registration or land titling system, it doesn't matter. All SFU needs to do is show that first title. Morally, I think it does. Morally, I think it's important for SFU and any colonial title holder to be able to show how it got the land. If SFU were required, in other words, to demonstrate how its current title was anchored in a chain of prior transactions, I don't think it could. Anyway, let's go back to our story. How on earth was it that the city or district of Burnaby owned the land in 1963, particularly district lots 209, 210, and 211? Turns out it had acquired most of the land in the early years of the 20th century. In 1927, the Burnaby city clerk noted that 3/4 of the land between Burrard Inlet, which is the ocean to the north of us, and Burnaby Lake to the south of us, was owned by the municipality. It had sat on it for 50 years. It had tried to make a park, but not much had happened to it. But as we saw in the previous slide, prior to this, most of the land seems to have been held by multiple separate owners. So what happened? What happened was, of course, a very familiar Vancouver story: land speculation, property boom, property bust. Now, land speculation, of course, has been central to the colonial project from its inception. And the early 20th century, in particular after about 1909, saw a particularly massive land boom. 1910, there were 600 real estate agents in Vancouver. By 1912, there were 1,000. That's one for every 100 citizens in Vancouver, probably about the same as it is now. People were encouraged to sink their savings into, settlers were encouraged to sink their savings into land purchases that seemed assured of a profitable return. This is a real estate advert for J.W. Horn in 1911, lots for sale. This is a quote from our report from an exuberant promoter in the early years of the century. Do you know how I would write a dissertation on how to be rich in Vancouver? Take a map of the Lower Peninsula, shut your eyes, stick your finger anywhere, and sit tight. But what's striking is this wasn't just happening in downtown Vancouver. Speculation became increasingly generalized, and it was generalized both socially, as we'll see, but also spatially, including places like the top of Burnaby Mountain. And Burnaby Mountain in 1910 there was no road, there was no development. It was burnt over forest and scrubland. In December 1911, the British Columbia magazine celebrated the homes that had been carved out of the so-called wilderness, displacing the Siwash, which is a Chinook word for indigenous person, derogatory here, I imagine, and the forests where his campfires burned. The growth of this city will continue at its present rate for a great many years, we've heard that before, so that home building will continue to be a safe and profitable form of investment, with residential sections extending out to Burnaby as the streetcar lines are being extended. And a retrospective in 1947 talked about Burnaby Mountain, the top of Burnaby Mountain, being surveyed and subdivided into town lots. To within half a mile of the North Road, the virgin forest was dotted with surveyors' stakes. And we see this in the archive. So the image on the left comes from the transfer of land to SFU. Because when the city of Burnaby transferred the land, it became clear that it was transferring a whole bunch of, if you will, ghost subdivisions, subdivisions that had been created and never realized. So this is District Lot 209, 210, and 211. And remember, this is forest at the time. And as you can see, it's been carved up into not just large blocks, but also small subdivisions, town lots, in fact. This is an image from DL 147, which is just to the south of us. And you can see imagined streets, Argyle Street, Aberdeen Avenue, Dufferin Avenue, being imagined onto this empty space insofar as settlers were concerned. So we are now roughly at the intersection, just so you know, of Lakedale Avenue and Mountain Road. I have some images over here, if anyone's interested at the time. These are some of the maps that I actually pulled from the archive. We pulled from the archive that show some of these subdivisions. Now, this process of subdivision was crucial because it facilitated purchases by small speculators who were encouraged to buy these hypothetical parcels by land holding companies. And these subdivisions, of course, were entirely aspirational, projecting imagined possibilities onto what was still scrub and forest on top of a mountain with no road access. So land speculation required a form of speculative imagination. One syndicate, is an image, purchased DL District Lots 209 and 210, where we are in 1908. They sold the land under the no fake or hot air banner. And they tell you, the image here, they tell you how respectable they are, these people who own the land. They're bankers and solid men, so you can trust them. They noted that while the land was, quote, high, it had a, quote, gentle slope to the south. By June 1908, the price had risen to $85 an acre. Here you can see it's being sold at $60 per acre. By 1912, a more sustained real estate campaign began. District Lots 209 and 210, where we were rebranded as Scenic Heights. Could have been Glengarry, Glen Ross, those of you who remember the old film. The public was assured that Hastings Street was going to be extended to the top of the mountain soon. Bus service was imminent. Hadn't just quite got there yet. And this worked. A lot that cost $225, a small individual town lot, a lot that cost $225 in February 1912 had risen to $275 by the end of the year. And you see in the media a sustained year-long FOMO ad campaign that was clearly targeting people of modest means, the working man or the man with a modest salary. Here we have a family that's struggling with the cost of living. The cost of living is too high. How can you make ends meet? Well, if you can just set aside 33 cents a day, then you can get a town lot which is assured of a steady and safe return. 33 cents a day will make you independent. Follow the wise few rather than the foolish many, noted the ads. And the wise few were buying land dubbed, quote, the last link, or the Point Grey of eastern Vancouver, that was only half a mile from the waterfront. And those of you who don't know SFU will know that half a mile it is from the waterfront, but it's basically a sheer drop. And prospective buyers who were concerned at social mobility were assured that the purchase of a lot at Scenic Heights would allow them to pay for their son to go to university, which of course is more than slightly ironic. Free trips to view the lots were offered to entice buyers, but again, despite the puffery, Scenic Heights was nothing more insofar as the settler perspective than scrub and forest. It didn't stop the promoters. Quote, think of the pleasure your wife will derive from the beautiful panorama of lakes and trees, and the happiness of seeing your children thrive in the pure air and sunshine. And subdivision parcels were flipped and reflipped with no evidence of actual land use or occupation. People likely were buying them without actually having seen them. So for example, the top half of Lot 8 of District Lot 210, which is roughly where my office is now, shows the following transactions according to the land titles record. On the 21st of March, Arthur Phillips buys the land. He flips it to Arthur Jones on the 17th of September. Arthur Jones sells it the same day to Jane Watts, who sells it to Antonio Graff on the 21st of December, 1910. Graff sells it to Matthias Grota on the 22nd of December, who sells it to Sarah Armstrong on October 1911, and she sells it to Charles Brown on the 26th of August, 1912. The Lot 8 flipped 7 times in 2 years. This pyramid scheme, of course, is going to collapse, and it collapses big time. Charles Brown did not reflip the land. The record shows that it was acquired by the District of Burnaby. It was acquired by the District of Burnaby through a tax sale. Brown did not pay his taxes. Brown was not alone. Land prices peaked in 1912, but the real estate bubble burst big time. Vancouver's building permits, which had reached $19 million in 1912, fell to less than $1 million by 1915. Modest investors, working class investors, were forced into bankruptcy, and most of the private owners on the mountain were presumably unable or unwilling to pay their property taxes. Consequently, the land reverted, so-called, to the municipality. It tried to sell the land off, but because of the property collapse, there were very few takers. Thus, the land remained in city hands until the 1960s. Let me segue over to Kyle.
So that we can keep your attention, the constant switching, right? Thank you.
Can I go back one slide?
This is the Charles Bodie who signs as this official surveyor.
I don't know. Quite likely. Oh, yeah. Playing both ends. Quite likely. I don't know.
All right. Obviously, I think a lot of the processes that that Nick's just described there, we observe quite a bit today in the Vancouver region, where the politics of property loom quite large in our daily conversations. And it is the social and spatial bases of land speculation and rentier capitalism can similarly help to explain colonial land expropriation. And as you know, we saw this with the roller coaster here of speculation on this single lot. And now the question that we have to ask next really is, how did this land even become available for this type of land use, for this speculation? So we know that land ultimately became available, the transfer in 1963 to SFU through a process of failed speculation after 1912. But the events that precede this one are also of failed land speculation. So it's land speculation on top of land speculation, but of a different form. Rather than many small local speculators, this entailed large offshore investors who snapped up huge amounts of land on the mountain in expectation of a sure return. And this is where our methodology sort of asks us to think about the explanation of how these processes of dispossession occurred through individuals who subdivided lots, and now even further back, as I'll discuss, those who purchased entire district lots and waited for others to improve the land. I want to now turn into the story of unproductive rentier capitalism, as we'll call it, fueled by colonial presumptions of white supremacy and various ideas about civilization, assimilation, and the negation of indigenous relations to land. Ironically, of course, those land uses were always presumed to be wasteful and unproductive by settlers. So the speculative bubble that starts on Burnaby Mountain was initiated by an Edward Pullman. Pullman was an offshore investor based in Spokane, Washington, so not too far from where we are, and had significant interests in various BC mining processes. He had acquired about half a dozen district lots in 1900. He reputedly bought the land for less than $1 an acre. And in 1908, he subdivided district lots 209 and 210 into smaller parcels, as you can see here. And you can sort of see his signature down here, right there, Edward Pullman. And this facilitated the process of... Oh, the pointer, yes, that's great, yeah. There we go. That's much better. Pullman helped to facilitate the process that Nick described by doing a lot of land subdividing. Prior to Pullman, however, the land was previously owned by John Ross Ford, who was another offshore investor from England, from Rochester, England, where he served in political office, various political offices, and there is no evidence to suggest that Ford ever was physically here. And at some point, Ford owned approximately 8,000 acres of land across the new Westminster land district. This is a representation of the entire land district, as you can see, SFU, the mountain being somewhere right about up here. He owned 8,000 acres across most of this area here. It turns out, however, that Ford, like others, did not pay their taxes on this large amount of land. And in 1900, it seemed that authorities had enough, right? And a major case was brought against him by several municipalities where this land was, to recover the unpaid taxes. And they were seized, tenders to purchase were invited, and only a few on the mountain were sold at this time. In February of 1900, the BC Supreme Court actually issued 2 orders against Ford, who owed about $3,700 in taxes at that time. And it was through this process that Ford, this process that Pullman acquired the land from, in terms of the chain, from Ford. Ford, interestingly enough, when he died a couple of years, or sorry, 1902, he was described as one of the largest landowners in basically the region, Burnaby, Coquitlam, New Westminster. And an interesting sort of obituary reported that he will be remembered, quote, as only as a non-large resident landowner. Interestingly enough, the obituary went on in many other directions, and it almost, in some respects, almost like was like berating him for not taking advantage of this great opportunity that he had. It's a very strange obituary. So the story of speculation that we see is also a story of how the state generates and manages revenue. This is something that I study. And it's of interest to us how the state seeks to protect and promote development through this management of revenue. So I want to talk about how we got from here, from original laws authorizing the taxation of property, right, to the wild lands tax, and then tax arrears. So Ford loses his land to tax arrears. You can see, we'll go here. These are the council minutes from the District of Burnaby, in which John Ross Ford, as you can see, is being written up in the council minutes as being delinquent on their taxes for several years. Now, the land sales and associated real property taxes were one of the few ways that colonial state could recoup revenue to develop things like, roads, physical infrastructure, administrative institutions that might be involved in the administering of land sales, of property rights, enforcement, contracts, representation. But it also provided for protection, both in terms of personal security, but also security and stability of ownership. And broadly in colonial contexts such as BC, where white settlement was not a guarantee, but an aspiration, right, of colonial administrators, property tax had an additional political function. It was, in effect, a guarantee that the state backed an individual's right to hold that plot of land, promising security based on an inalienable property rights to protect settlers while seeking to sever indigenous connection to the land. The meaning of land was reimagined as a contractual relation between white possession that flowed from the authority of the crown and in opposition to indigenous nations. And what we see here in this law, the Wild Lands Tax, which was originally passed in 1872, which is an interesting story, this form of taxation sought to curb speculation, but also in many respects also to promote development. So in line with both of the province's goals of promoting white settlement while also reducing at some respect speculation so that speculation would be regarded as productive, the Wild Lands Tax sought to penalize speculators who did not improve the land. And it also, at the same time, remained, again, low enough that it would not discourage development. The law had an allowance of about 2 years before it came into effect, meaning that property owners had a great deal of time to improve their land before being assessed the tax. Now, the role of tax in facilitating settlement and in discouraging speculation that would not result in improved land. So in other words, both sides of the tax equation were about trying to ensure that settlers would use their land correctly, right? That they would develop. We can also see that the province's attempt to use taxation and policies like the land registry system and other things like that were much less, right, about land use and much more about ensuring that a particular class of industrious, desirable, we saw them in the ads, right, industrious, desirable British subjects were settling, staying, and building British Columbia on Indigenous lands. Importantly, Ford, if we return to him, was subject to the Wild Lands Tax on his quote-unquote unimproved lands. And again, as we can return here, we can see Burnaby chastising him for this. So Holman acquired the land from Ford, who lost the land from a tax sale. So how did Ford get the land to begin with? He acquired it from John Rowland Hett, who was the first private purchaser of the land. And he bought it from the Crown he purchased lots 209, 210, and 211 on 17 April 1875, paying about around $2,500 at the time, or much, much, much more today. So what was it that Hett and other colonial title holders acquired? Obviously, they came to own a parcel of land, but property, of course, is not land as such, but rather a bundle of enforceable rights vis-a-vis others in regards to a valued resource like land. But how did it become a parcel? Something that was actually purchasable. The lot itself was produced through a survey of the mountain. And while some forms of colonial dispossession could occur before a survey, sales of lands required it. And seemingly sort of banal, right? This process is not simply the outcome of the process of dispossession, rather it is integral to it, right? So guides took G.S. Blake over Burnaby Mountain in 1859. North Road was surveyed in 1861. And surveys were also done up until 1874 when they were, district lots were carved out by the surveyor, William Pinder. Historical geographer Cole Harris notes, quote, British Columbia could not have been reorganized into colonial spaces without something like the map, end quote. So not only did the map allow settlers to navigate in an unfamiliar space, it was also fundamental in the process of land reallocation. Harris further notes that property, quote, required a location and maps were the means of establishing it. End quote. Converted into finite units, it became possible to imagine land as exclusive, severable, defensible space rather than a set of relations and obligations. And in terms of settler law, Hett had purchased his lots from the previous owner, which was the Crown. The Crown grant, which we saw earlier, grounds Hett's title assertion that Queen Victoria has given or granted the land to him. So Hett is not the first owner. In terms of colonial law, the Crown is anchoring the chain of title that ultimately makes it possible for us to even consider SFU's title to begin with. So therefore, as we must ask with SFU, Hett, Holman, and the other folks, how did the Crown get title to this land? The answer requires an understanding of Crown title. Not only is it that the Crown that sustains SFU's current title to the land, it's also the Crown that first stole the land from Indigenous nations to begin with. And as SFU's territorial acknowledgement recognizes, this is unceded land. And so in other words, the land wasn't purchased, right, or acquired via treaty, but was simply taken via the, through a colonial assertion, right? This assertion was materialized in this proclamation issued by the governor at the time, James Douglas. And this declared that, quote, all the lands in British Columbia belong to the Crown in fee. So the initial theft of the land that SFU now sits upon was realized through the assertion of Crown title. Canadian courts have accepted 1846 as the date by which the Crown obtained underlying sovereignty over the lands that were to become British Columbia. This meant that, legally speaking, the Crown owned all of the land. Scholars Nicholas Claxton and John Price argue that Canadian courts' persistence in claiming that the Crown asserted sovereignty over British Columbia was a present-day reassertion of the, quote, doctrine of discovery. And this hundreds-year-old doctrine presumes that the land is empty if it's not occupied and used by Christians. It rests on a very racist hierarchy in which indigenous people are presumed to lack the capacity to govern the affairs of their nations, to govern lands. And it also further encodes colonial ideas about land use, land stewardship, and the labor theory of property into land. So these ideas imagined European colonists as universal, enlightened oracles of civilization, while others, indigenous people, were cast as lacking knowledge and the capacities for civilization. And this is what the doctrine of discovery is based on. And it is the case that, for example, Métis legal scholar Joshua Nichols argues that Aboriginal laws and its historical foundations have always flowed from the doctrine of discovery. Even in the age of reconciliation, right, Nichols suggests that courts' dutiful interpretation of Aboriginal title, sovereignty, and governance relies entirely on an unquestioning acceptance of the Crown's assertion of sovereignty, legislative power, and underlying title. So the very idea of Crown sovereignty and its assumed doctrinal supremacy over Aboriginal title and Indigenous nations was constructed on an ad hoc basis, what Nichols refers to as results-oriented results-oriented law. In other words, contemporary legal cases, Crown sovereignty often ended up as a post hoc justification through which courts cannot account. In the process, this land that we're on right now was remade through all of these processes that we have detailed and documented. No longer was this shared land, no longer was this land that multiple nations used. It was now claimed as the property of the Crown and sliced into the imaginary parcels that we're seeing here for the use and benefit, as our reports show, of many people who have never even laid eyes on it. So just as this, the Coast Salish welcoming figure greets us as we ascend the mountain, welcoming us really to Coast Salish territories. And this particular welcoming figure is from the Squamish artist Jody Broomfield. And while it welcomes us, the figure we must also keep in mind the place of injustice and the work that we must continually do that recognizes the sovereignty of Indigenous nations on this land. Work that I see many examples of happening here at SFU, right, in various spaces. And we hope that this presentation has offered some clarity in answering this question of how did SFU get its land, but also helps us to think through what that means for us right now. And I think that's extremely important. So this concludes our presentation. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and thanks especially as well to Professor Hall for those comments that really helped to I think ground the presentation in a very serious way. So we do have time for questions. I'm not sure what our time is now, but we've got time for questions. Those that are assembled with us here on the mountain. And I want to remind everybody to remain respectful, and I'd invite comments, questions, thoughts, especially from those that are especially from host nations or from other folks from other Indigenous nations, whether that's staff, faculty, students. Great. That seems like I guess we'll just re-say it.
The question in the back, if you could say it loudly and then we'll say it on the mic. Does that work? Okay.
I know there are big trees, and then of course there are some that are not trees. Just give a little bit more, try to get more light on how there was Douglas trees that happened versus the context of where it could be.
So thank you. So there was a question about I guess broadly the legal status of land in British Columbia, noting that there are some treaties, the so-called Douglas treaties. There's also a treaty in northeastern British Columbia as well. And the question is how land here would differ from, say, treaty land. Is that broadly the question?
Why did it happen in some cases?
Oh, why? Well, that's a function of James Douglas. So Governor James Douglas was the first governor of British Columbia. For various complicated reasons, felt it appropriate to create treaties with people like the Wasanich and others in what is now southern Vancouver Island to facilitate land settlement. But he then retired, and land policy moved to Trutch. And Trutch is actually, he's on the land title for the Crown Grant from 1875. His name is on there as the Lieutenant Governor, who sort of attests to that title. Trutch had a very different understanding of his obligations insofar as treaties were concerned. He refused to accept that there was any notion that there was any title to the land held by Indigenous people. Therefore, there was nothing to have treaties about. It was, if you will, terra nullius, empty land. Now, as to the status of the Douglas treaties, I'm not an expert or historian. I understand that there is some ambiguity as to whether those were land cessions. And I think many people, Wasanich people, would argue that they weren't giving the land away, rather they were engaged in a reciprocal understanding of land access and use. That was read very differently. But as you point out, there are no treaties on the land we currently sit on. There is a modern day treaty process that is unfolding in a rather problematic way on other territories. Do you want to add to that?
No, I think that's a good, yeah.
Yes.
Beginning, how do you unpack that with your students?
That's a very good question. I would probably unpack it by asking them questions, because that's the way I think I like to teach. I would ask them I would ask them if they know what it means that the land is ceded or not ceded. And then I think I would then open that space to the conversation in part that we just had. My experience is that people aren't really quite sure what that means or what it doesn't mean. So it does then create a kind of conversation. But as I noted, I could only go so far because I didn't know the story of this land. I'm a geographer and I care very deeply about the land I'm on and the spaces I'm in and using that as a resource, a teaching resource and so on. And so that for me was one of the motivations for doing this work, to be able to take this in the classroom and say, well, I'm glad you asked me that question about the land acknowledgement. Let's try and understand that process. And actually in the classroom, I would try and get the students, this is when I was struggling with this, try and get the students to research the land title. I'd say, this is SFU's land title. This is a public document. Please try and figure out, where the chain of title is. And of course, they couldn't do it. And I think that's a kind of teachable moment as well.
One thing that I'll also say in relation to the land acknowledgement, can you repeat the question again? Okay.
Talk a lot about land acknowledgements, so I'm curious how you unpack that with your students and how you introduce that and how you make it so that it's not just checking off a box. That you make it like.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's lots of resources there. I mean, I think one of the things that I'll say in relation to this, I'll build off something that Dr. Hall mentioned, and that was, right, decolonization is not a metaphor, especially in thinking about like land. And so I think that one of the strengths of what we've produced here, right, is that it helps to fill in the detail, right, around what it actually means for this land to be unceded, right? And so I think that's a pretty valuable sort of resource for us to think about decolonization not as metaphor. Think about, like, when we're talking about land, that these are not metaphor, these are not words, but these are material realities for people, right? And for the nations. Thank you.
Ceded Aboriginal title, and Aboriginal title means, you have the right to Aboriginal rights. Although this is not recognized, an important part of Aboriginal title right is the right to the economic benefits of the land. In regard to the expansion of SFU now, we know this. If we're not being performative, it's not a metaphor. How do we take that into account into the way in which SFU continues its expansion on these lands and the rights to the next generations and such that are for the title?
You want to field that one?
It's a very good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to repeat the question. Yeah.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
It was a very long question. So the question was about Aboriginal title and what we
Economic
can do,
benefits,
the economic benefits, and the relationship to the fact that the university is still benefiting and expanding on those lands. That's a good one, Xander. Yeah, okay. I mean, one of the things that I like to point out is that there has been huge amount of work, right, that has happened at this university, right? That there has been, whether it's through the Office of Aboriginal People, through the steering committees, the Indigenous colleagues, allies that are doing work to help us rethink the university's relationship. And I think until if we take our foot off the gas, then then those things are not really going to be happening, right? And so I think that's one of the other key takeaways for this report is, I think that with the American political context, that there's lots of oxygen being taken up, but people need to realize that these fights are here, right? And they're material and they're real, and that people should be doing what they can, right? Sure. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. You're getting, yeah, it should. And I mean, so the question was, sorry, do we think, and just to be clear, I'm not an oracle here. I just did the archival work. We're all smart people, and so this is a collective conversation. So I don't want to suggest that, so the question was, as a public institution, should the university play a particular role in addressing questions of reconciliation in relation to the economic benefit associated with land? And my response was absolutely. I suppose the interesting question is, what might that look like? What might that look like going forward? University's been talking about trying to monetize its assets in interesting ways in the recent budget crisis. It has land elsewhere, of course. The university is deriving a benefit from university. Some of that land, some of that benefit is coming back in terms of benefits by way of research, support, scholarships, and so on. Is it enough? I don't know. University, or the trust, and I'm trying to get this right, the trust that's associated with university has dissolved. So it's become harder to actually unpack that. But to me, that would be an interesting question to try and unpack where is the money flowing that's coming from those 99-year leases on university that, as we speak, are actually being flogged, right? As you come up the mountain, you see those signs on stolen land, selling 99-year leases on stolen land. Where is that money going to? That would be an interesting report that somebody should do. We had a question over here, I think.
So I'm going to kind of walk back here. One is riding the R35, 135, R5, and a bus driver who was a property owner and said he had been going to every single city council meeting, and he never heard when the permission had been given to build university. Like, he literally said he had never heard of it. And so that you'd say that the trust has been dissolved, I'm hearing that very clear, like that is large in my head. I guess, I wanted to stick to the report, which I've gone through twice while I'm sitting here. Thank you for developing it. And I want to kind of go back to the James Douglas thing, because the Caribbean relative.
Yeah.
So, I'll call that in there. And I guess the question is we see the slippery slope between Hudson Bay Company giving up, like where he's both the chief factor and then he's the governor. There's that very curious moment where he's both, then he gives it up. But in my research on him, he begged England for more money and they refused.
Yeah.
They absolutely refused to give him more money to do treaties. So I'm very interested in the combination of the kind of the state and the corporation of Port Hudson Bay for this slippery slope that is very close to us in terms of as you've been reading. And I also would say with these wars, obviously the Oregon Treaty stuff, this rings for me now with what we have. I look at aluminum, so this whole tariff thing going on, where I'm watching people go, we have to support Canada, and I'm like, economic security and national security, all these things start to shadow reconciliation work, like real reconciliation work, that we have to kind of stick together as Canadians. And I find it actually quite troubling in terms of how this kind of, how America shadows and this identity of Canadianness, especially in these unceded territories. So back to my question, which is the curious place of the university trust being dissolved, right? And then and university as a newer project, and then just how I would tie it to the colony, crown.
Yeah.
Sorry, the corporation versus the crown development that Douglas is in that nexus, if you will.
So those of you who were on Zoom and didn't hear that, you missed out, because that was a wonderful series of very powerful comments that spoke to colonial histories as well as their contemporary resonances. And there was a question about university. And so for those of you who don't know SFU, university has a C in it, not an S in it. It's a sort of academic joke, as far as I can tell. It only works if you're an academic. There is material around that. In 1995, there was an agreement between the university and the district and so on. So we mentioned it in the report, and I'm not sure if there's a link to the materials there, but if you're interested, I can try and find those for you. There was a question about Douglas and the creation of the colony, the two colonies, because it was the mainland and the Vancouver Island that were created. I mean, the story was basically they were broke. London gave them no money, because it's hard being an empire. You have to manage all this land. I speak as a Brit, ironically. So you had to be they had to be self-supporting, and the only way that Douglas could could generate money was really through land, through stolen land, through selling stolen land. And the challenge was how to do that. And so you see it through land auctions, you see it through land preemptions and so on. And so land sales, and then tax on land, of course, which is, I think, so interesting to the story here. And there's all sorts of contemporary resonances about, empty homes tax and so on, offshore investors and so on. I think there's interesting dynamics there as well. So thanks for your observation. Yeah, Douglas was he Barbadian? Guyanese. Yes, I think. Thank you. With an Indigenous wife. Very interesting character. Yeah.
Yeah. I was interested in sort of development of multiple activators throughout the story, and the sort of dynamic that is as a whole, but also this persistent theme within the sort of capitalist development of the main people that produce industry or whatnot, like capitalists, these people that they're trying to draw, also the kind of people who resist taxes most of all.
Right.
And this sort of
weird interplay where they understand that taxes are power being exerted on them and they refuse it, but they also don't understand how those taxes can be useful in the long run to them. Like this kind of weird dynamic of taxes as a.
Sure. This is a very interesting story, right? Yes, and for those that don't know me, I do a lot of research on taxation and fiscal policy in relation to colonialism. And yes, you are observing a very interesting sort of, let's say, contradiction, perhaps. But I think the reason that this, okay, so some research that I've done looks at right-wing political organizations and how it is that they think about taxation. And what the research that I found that I've done is shown broadly that anti-tax groups really don't like taxes, but they also really like taxes because they understand what it guarantees, right? And so, a lot of organizations, or whether that are organizations of capitalists, whether that's organizations of landowners, whomever, right? These groups usually do understand the value of tax, right, in terms of its contractual relationship with the state, right? But, right, they are very keen on ensuring that other people still don't like taxes too much so that, they don't start coming for their wealth, sort of a thing. So that's the way I would sum that up.
Yes.
They will work at will be for teachers in other public institutions other than SFU. And we're interested in going about a particular process, though maybe not as in-depth as you folks about having a connection between the original stewards of the land and today. How might we go about that?
Oh, tracing the connection to the original stewards. Yeah, I mean, that's not something we did. I mean, let's be clear. We honor that relationship, but deliberately bracketed our story, or I bracketed the story because I kind of began the process as a non-Indigenous person, as trying to understand, in a sense, my archive, right? My colonial archive that I benefit from and invested in. There are other archives, of course. The archives of the Tsleil-Waututh and the Coquitlam and so on. And of course they have knowledge keepers and there are protocols through which one can access that knowledge and expertise. It has to be done, of course, respectfully and carefully. I don't know if Winona wants to speak to that or Kyle, but I would, I think it done right, there would be powerful ways in which students in a classroom could begin to see those connections narrativized and enacted, not just through words, but also through song and ceremony and so on. Do you want to, Manoj, do you want to talk to
that? I'll say briefly about the replicating, right? I think that's a great idea, number one, to start thinking about the way that this can be expanded, because again, this is also the chain of this research is also the fact that we're doing this in response as well to other scholars that have been looking at universities across Canada and the United States, right? So we're following in some respects that lead, but also the one thing that I think and Nick, you can attest to this likely, right, as the person that spent most of the time in the archives, right? These things are different across all kinds of across place, right? So quite a bit. So there isn't like a consistent single methodology or method that I think works here. I think most of this obviously resides in the archive on the colonial side, and then for Indigenous nations and relationships between Indigenous nations and settlers, then that's a completely other different process that obviously as Nick I think made the point involves a little bit more care and attention and things of this sort. Thanks.
I'll see you in a second. I'm just going to, but I mean, just thank you. But on that, to try to do the colonial story, I mean, what for me is so striking is how bloody hard it is to do, how opaque that archive is. And I mean, I've done similar work in other spaces. working with indigenous folk, and they will tell me in an indigenous legal context, you know, there are protocols by which you make clear your relationship to the land, and protocols by which you change that relationship, for example. And they have to be witnessed, and they have to be done in community, they have to be done very, very transparently. But that doesn't work in the colonial context, you know, where you know, the archive is just absent, or a clerk has written, all records gone. You know, you see that, all records gone. The title just carries on. Yes.
Who stole the mountain? Was it the crown or the colony? When it wasn't kind of incorporated?
Very straight question. So the question was which individual or which collective stole the mountain? Well, that might be a complicated question because no. I can tell you my answer. I think if we were to speak to Tsleil-Waututh, they might have a different story. And so, or Musqueam, Musquamish, and so I won't speak for them. But insofar as the archive is concerned, the Crown, which is a legal abstraction, stole the land insofar as no. It was the Crown. Now the Crown, you know, the Crown is again, it's interesting. You know, indigenous people have these myths and crazy things, but colonial people don't. I mean, the Crown is a crazy thing, right? It's an abstraction. It sort of symbolizes sovereignty. In this context, I think it is the Crown in right of British Columbia, legally speaking. And as such, the Crown, or Governor Douglas, who was acting on behalf of the Crown, issued a proclamation in which he declared all the lands of British Columbia are owned by the Crown, or the colonial state, in fee. And so that's theft insofar as I think most indigenous laws are concerned. And it would arguably, it's also theft insofar as colonial law is concerned, because the legal status of that assertion has become the subject for litigation that continues. So that's one answer. Sorry, I can't give you a more immediate answer. Bob.
The university has its own archive.
Yes.
To your knowledge, has the university project archive, which is now, the trust is now dissolved or dissolving.
Okay.
Is it installed in the SFU archive, and will it be available?
Okay, good question. So the question was, has the archive of the University with a C, development on District Lot 211, been transferred to SFU University Archive? I don't know the answer to that. If you could find out, I'd be very grateful. Yeah.
Trust is created because the CRA, Canada Revenue Agency, required an arm's length relationship between the proceeds of all the transactions in university and the university.
Okay.
So that the university was not to receive it directly. It had to be pooled.
Okay.
In a trust.
So the university was created as a response to tax. Our friend Bob has told us that university, the trust rather, was created to create an arm's length relationship with the corporation, or the legal form that is the university separately. Yeah, Isabella.
I have some questions about which you said, with that theme line that the window of time, which in otherwise. So that how, could that sort of speed up flipping of money? That makes sense. How long will that bring require?
Yeah, so the question, I'll just reiterate this question that I'll answer, and then we'll hand it over to Nick for the title question. The question relates to, you know, the temporal relationship between the wildlands tax and improvement, right? So, yeah, so there was like, there were these clauses, right? These carve-outs for time in terms of you wouldn't be assessed if you had improved within a particular period of time. But again, that was part and parcel of the political move that it was attempting, right? It's saying, like, the tax didn't exist to punish, right? The tax existed to encourage, right? To incentivize, to push people to do things. And so, yeah, I think that's broadly what I would say in response, right? So you know, you have a range of people at various points of the process. You have there was also like quite a bit more discretion, I think, that bureaucrats and municipalities had in pursuing these taxes. So it might be the case that if a particular area was starting to see lots of development, that they might, right, seek to clamp down on these relationships so that those people would not simply be using their land poorly, right? On the tax?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question was, what does it cost to access land titles records? They are behind a paywall, and land titles is actually a, you know, profit-making enterprise. Mostly this is, you know, so realtors and lawyers, when they're flipping land in Kitsilano, they need to check the title to make sure there's no encumbrances and mortgages and stuff, and so they'll pay. There's a flat fee to do that. You can apply to get that waived if you are engaged in research, and that's what I was able to do. So it is possible to do so, but they're not, it's not an archive in the sense that you might be familiar with, say, the BC archive. They don't have archivists. They just have people at the front desk who are just, they can do, you know, current transactions. They have no idea of the deep archive. I had to find a sort of fossilized land titles person who'd been doing it for 50, 60 years. And he's one of the last, there's only about 3 or 4 of these people left who actually know how to navigate that archive. And this is actually, I mean, historically, this is a huge deal, right? I mean, because this is a very important resource that we're in serious danger of losing simply because we don't know how to access it. I think maybe we have time for one more question, and then we're going to have to, I'm going to go way over there. Yeah. No, you, yes, Jed, yes.
But in terms of adding some clarity to the opacity of the archives, the university with the C is a wholly owned subsidiary of the university. And the effect of this is that they stop being university records, which means they stop being public records, and become private records. Those records are necessarily going to go to a public archives, and they're also not accessible through access to information legislation. So they sort of become, by becoming arm's length, they become less accessible, and you're less able to see what's going on in that parcel of land.
So thank you. So the observation was that the university with a C archive has now become rolled into the university SFU's material, and that's not a public record. That's not something necessarily we can access. But of course, the university is fully committed to reconciliation. Well, they are, and on that basis, they say they are, and on that basis, maybe it's an interesting ask. We're interested. I mean, we would like, given the question that was raised earlier, how much profit is being generated on stolen land? Could you please tell us? I did try, and it was hard to find out. But on the principle of, we should have a vice president of data management and sharing. Sorry. But on the principle of this is just our little kind of contribution, you know, we would like others to pick up that work and, you know, encourage folk to do so. Okay, maybe you can speak to us individually, if that's okay. I think maybe we should wrap.
Yes.
Yeah, so we'd like to thank you all so very much for coming. Thanks to Winona, Dr. Hall for presentations for that, and thanks to our awesome support staff, folk in the back, and Justin and everyone. Thanks so much. There are still copies, a few here, and there are QR codes if you want to get a copy of the report. Thanks so much. I know we get sat down.